I first started gathering earth to make paint in 2011. That was a very difficult year for my family and also for my painting practice. I was just stuck. And so I thought, in order to move forward with my work, I need to go backwards. And so I returned to the fundamentals of painting, which is learning about paint. And I was already starting to make paint then, but not with earth pigments. And that fall, I took a class at the John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina with the artist Sandy Webster, and she is awesome. And we learned how to gather earth pigments. It was wonderful, and it changed the path of my painting practice. I loved being outside and digging my hands into the dirt, looking for color. The process of turning clays, shales, and rocks into paint is very, very physical and tedious, but also meditative. From pounding rocks in a granite mortar and pestle to holding a cool glass muller in between my hands, turning pigment and linseed oil into paint, I finally began to understand my medium and find a path that I loved to pursue. I always get excited to find a new color, and my husband, sometimes I'll come home, Jason, guess what I found today? It was a beautiful green, and it looks kind of gray and nothing spectacular, but it's beautiful, And the other day, I went on a little pigment journey with my friend Caitlin, and on the side of Interstate 24, we found a beautiful limestone shale, and this is pigmented with hematite, which is an iron oxide. So one of my favorite rocks that I found so far, and I haven't made it into paint yet, but I'm really excited. A little history, and I won't get too far into it, but before and during the Renaissance, artists would have to grind their own rocks and crush insects to make their color, among other things. Leonardo da Vinci, his patrons would get so impatient with him because he would spend so much time pounding pigments, processing, preparing before he would even start painting. The practice of painting became more of an art profession rather than a craft profession, right? So these artists wanted to be about the more significant aspects of their practice, right? Making the artwork, and we don't want to worry about the dirty stuff with dirt, right? And the laborious, tedious aspect of the work. Clay is a material of creation in many ancient origin stories, right? So from the Middle East, China, Africa, the Americas, God takes the clay, forms man, and breathes his spirit into him. These seemingly unimportant materials, rocks and dirt, become something very sacred. Oh, and the painting behind you guys, Mother, Father, that painting loosely references this sense of origin, right? Mother, father. And I love etymology, and the word mother is also related to material, something that has become very much important in my work. What is the material I'm working with, right? And father is related to the word pattern, right? So material and pattern. Soil tone and skin tone complement each other beautifully. And I've used a lot of skin tones in this painting as well. Soil is also referred to as the skin of the earth. So as I started to collect materials from nature and create paintings from my immediate environment, I thought about structures that are built from their immediate environment, like the Cherokee wattle and daub dwelling, in which reeds are woven together. I also see patterns all the time in my home where I am every single day, right? I sit on the living room rug in the mornings with the sun streaming in, and I build blocks with my sons, and I make forts out of quilts, right? And these are my dwelling places. And so a lot of times that's where these patterns come from, the sun shining diagonally across the horizontal lines of a rug. So I think most importantly, my work is about relationships between colors and lines, between us and the land, from me to you, mothers and fathers to their children, and our exterior architecture to our interior architecture. May we slow down and notice things, the important things. May we be present with each other and ourselves, and may we realize that we are inextricably woven together. Thank you.
The big picture of my work is that I like to explore the transformative possibility of feminist materials. And more specifically, I take materials that represent women's work, gender roles, or things that come from the domestic sphere. I obviously I gravitate towards textiles quite a bit. And I want to reinvent or reimagine those materials and use them in a way that disassociates them from their original function or purpose, and use them in a way where your perception of these materials changes. And in general, I really like things that are sort of hard to classify. I mean, I hope to my work, but I like people that way, I like film that way, I mean, it's kind of my jam. So I want things to kind of flicker in between domestic and functional textiles, to have that hint, but also to become something else, and maybe just be hard to classify. Is it textile? Is it craft? Is it painting? Is it art? Is it heirloom? And also, I really appreciated listening to Amanda speak about her work, because I think it also flickers somewhere in between. You know, here I'm trying to make textiles into paintings, and she's making paintings that can be perceived as textiles or weavings. So to talk a little bit about how I got there, it actually started by studying painting at Boston University. I was sort of a painter for a very long time, and I loved studying painting. And I think one of my favorite things, and maybe least favorite things too about art school now that I think about it, but I'm going to stick with favorite, is that you're sort of forever brainwashed to see everything in the type or genre of artwork that you study. Like, I can look at a sculpture and think it's a painting. I look at a poster, I think it's a painting. I look at a room, I think it's a painting. I look at you guys or clothes or whatever, it's all a painting to me. And so you're kind of forever brainwashed, which is wonderful. But that became challenging when I started to work primarily in 2D and 3D sculpture and installation when I moved to New York. But before moving to New York, in between college and that journey, I moved back to Nashville and spent a couple months in my childhood home with my mom. I didn't have a job, I didn't have anything to do, and I had a lot of voices in my head from different professors who were bossing me around and inspiring me and telling me what to do while I was at school. But you know, you got a lot of voices in there, and you're trying to filter out and pick and choose, you know, how you want to apply it to your work. And for me, I needed to take a break from painting. So at this time at my mom's house, like I said, I didn't have a job. I was taking a break from painting, and so I started to just scavenge and pillage when she wasn't in the house. I'm in the bathroom, I'm in the kitchen drawers, and I started to pull out these very mundane domestic materials and transform them into art objects. The gateway drug for me of mixed media, if you will, was wax paper. So it really all started with wax paper, and I would use the wax paper to make garments that were appropriate for different rites of passage that were mostly, you know, specific to women in the South. And while I was trying to silence some of the bossier voices from art school, I was also turning up the volume of the voices while I was home of different generations of women who helped raise me or inform my identity in some way. And for the first 10 years, roughly, of me living in New York, I continued to really work on the side whenever I could, but more importantly, to develop this palette of feminist materials. So I started to work with pantyhose and tampons and cotton balls and Q-tips and garbage bags. And the world just sort of opened up that, you know, you can really make artwork out of anything. And that if I use materials that are storied or have some sort of, like I said, feminist association, I can use them as vehicles for my ideas and play with how they're perceived, which I'm still really interested in doing. And I realized in, I guess, 2009, 2010, that I think that the work of my time, or my life perhaps, is to bring together this mixed media palette with the practice of painting. And how can I join the two together and re-engage with the wall? So that became the challenge in my studio in 2009, 2010. The process is really interesting because I wear a lot of different hats. You know, there's some days where I'm painting and I believe that everything I'm putting down is a messy, sloppy brushstroke, even though it might be dry. And I still do painting and collage too, more traditional forms. But so all of the work that you see here is new. I think all the work in the whole show is new, which is exciting. But this was all made over the last year. And although the works vary, they are connected in a lot of ways. But in the way that I made them was a new way of working for me, where I've been working with different populations of women in my community. And these were the last works that I made for my show at the Friss Center. And the last room, which these ones were in, was dedicated to a body of work that I made after interviewing over 20 female elders from my community, starting with my grandmother's nursing home. I stepped back from her room after going to this program and realized there were so many stories that would be lost, that silence was creeping about in every room, and that I wanted to meet with as many women as possible and their families to learn what it is that other generations of women passed on to them that they deem worthy of passing on to future generations of women. The process of meeting with these women was so beautiful, and they were so generous. And in our conversations, I had no goals. I didn't really know what I was doing, other than this seemed like a beautiful and important thing to do, but I didn't know how to make artwork out of it. The women that I met with really helped me to reimagine or reclassify what a traditional heirloom can be or should be. And I think also younger generations of women are deeming things as heirlooms that really have no other inherent value, things that are just newly important to different generations of women. So in these two works, they represent two different categories of heirlooms that I discovered, and I discovered 4. So the categories are spirit-based heirlooms, object-based heirlooms, ritual-based heirlooms, and place-based heirlooms. And it was so beautiful to learn that, a place can be an heirloom, just a place that a family gravitates to generation after generation, not even a place people own necessarily. Like Lake Michigan was somebody's heirloom. I mean, it was very exciting. But so this one is spirit heirloom, moonlight on a shimmering rock. And a lot of the families that I met with were very religious, and their religion was their heirloom and what really threaded their family together. And it was hard. I mean, it's a big topic, and there was also different types of religions too. But I thought about how so many artists and painters before me have tried to describe religion or spiritual experiences with light, or in this case, with the absence of light. And so how can I use darkness to talk about a foundational rock that brings people together? So there's a rock, this large mound, which has become a really important shape to me, this whole mound sort of curve situation. It's in all of these works too. But spirit heirloom, moonlight on a shimmering rock, and the foundation for these pieces are all old cutter quilts, damaged quilts that I bought on eBay, or that people bring me all sorts of strange textiles. But I love being connected and sort of taking these doomed textiles and then giving them a new life. I've been so excited to see this work against a museum wall, which is such a beautiful white, and how this one disappears, even though physically its presence, is the same as that one. It gets subtracted by the white wall, which is really interesting to see. And then these swells, so the black pair are one piece and the green pair are one piece. And I love how they're hung here. And that's an exciting thing about working with a great curator, because they have new ideas about how to present your work that you didn't consider. But I love how they look in relation to each other. And this was the first experiment I made, sort of leaving the wall, and what happens when this mound and these circles actually starts to become three-dimensional and disengage from the wall and swell out. So that's a little bit on all of the works.
I grew up making art. It was something that I would sit in my room and draw for hours and hours, and my parents thought there was something wrong with me. I didn't need a lot of interaction. But for me, it's something that has almost become meditative. So I started off as a painter. Then I took a ceramics class and thought, oh, ceramics is wonderful. That sounds great. And then I took a metalsmithing class. And if you've never had experience with metalsmithing, I highly recommend it. But I absolutely fell in love with the medium. I've been doing it for about 20 years now, and it's something that I absolutely cannot get away from. So we all have stories. We grow up, life experiences change and shape who we are as a person. And when you're younger, a lot of that is all about identity. Who am I? What do I look like? How is my body perceived by the world? Is it beautiful? Especially as a young woman growing up, beauty is something that's very central to who we are as women. And the first few years of me making art as an artist, I kind of dealt with that subject matter. I began by working with the figure a long time ago, and most of the pieces that you see here and still today are self-portraits. My acceptance of my appearance and who I am as a woman and what that means in society and culture. So as you look around, I hope you kind of recognize that there is a little bit of a similarity between my face and these. Now, the sculptures that I have, I don't want them necessarily to look like me. That's not important. What I want you to see when you look at them is a human being. So some of them are somewhat androgynous, and a lot of them lack hair. And the reason is because hair is something that, for me, almost over-feminizes something and becomes an object of beauty. And I don't want these necessarily to be beautiful. I want them to be something that is a little bit more about the interpretation of the form. So if you look around, you'll see that there's some metals, sure, and there's also a lot of clay. And the reason there's a lot of clay is because I went through a time in my life when I couldn't do metals because of the toxic exposure to chemicals. It was something my body couldn't handle because I was pregnant. So sometimes you are kind of pushed into a different medium because of the experience that you're going through in life. So this large piece here is really only probably about the third piece I made in clay, and it was a technical experiment to see if it was even possible. And for any of you artists out there or students, please push the boundaries and do that for yourself, because that's the way you're gonna learn about things. And also you're gonna learn about what type of scale you like to work on, and also, you know, the strength of your work and where it comes from. For me, I work with what I like to call associations of visual language or narrative language. And what that means is if you look at my figures and you look at some of the sculptures, you will recognize certain forms. So we might have a uterus form or fallopian tubes or, you know, arrows, a rope, flowers. All of these things are this cultural association that comes into the way that we were raised. So, for example, the trophy is based on women having to live up to the stereotype of being the trophy wives. So not only do you have to go out and earn the money and be able to do all the wonderful things of the home, you also have to look good while you're doing it. So we have the antlers, we also have the arrows, and for me, the arrows are this way of her taking her power back. She is no longer being hunted, being the prey. She is now the one who has gained control of that existence. And a lot of the work that I'm making now is also about control, being able to identify what you can deal with and what you can't. This one right here is one of my latest. It's actually untitled at present, and there are two little small baby bunnies inside. And this is actually about a loss that I had. A lot of my work deals with infertility, and it is something that isn't always talked about a lot, as in our culture it's kind of a hidden thing. And I like to kind of bring things like that to the surface. I think it helps people to identify pain in people's lives as a way to kind of work through things, but also to understand that, you know, everything that we do in life is a journey. And there's a beginning, there's a middle, and someday there will be an end. But all the things that you get to learn and become a part of you will also shape you into a better human being. Are these things that we're taught when we're alive reality? Are they real? And, you know, we don't know. And I think that's really an interesting question. So, you know, the life cycle, birth, what you learn, experience, and finally death are really kind of what my life deals, or what my art deals with. So it's life experience.
For me, sort of talking about the trajectory and where I came from is usually the easiest way to contextualize the work. So a childhood spent in Indiana, in a very rural part of that state, and then as a family we moved to Middle Tennessee, to an equally rural part of Tennessee. And from there went on to college at Vanderbilt, and initially didn't know what I wanted to study. And after sort of like crossing off things that I knew I didn't want to do, I ended up in this art history class as a core requirement, humanities credit, and at the same time took a drawing class, a studio class, and that was the kind of semester where things coalesced. So when I found myself in my first sculpture class, it was this moment of like, oh wow, this stuff that I've been doing my whole life is sort of like research, and this is where it lives. And also a moment of recognition that I liked doing so many things that was part of why it had been hard to pick a field of study. And then when you find yourself in art, it's almost like a non-discipline. It's this place where like research in every topic in the world can intersect, and so your research can change from day to day to day. So the sort of like background growing up in rural agricultural places, and then this art historical background, but also like a broader interest in histories from that, because when you study art history, you're studying an image, but what you're really studying is the cultural context at the time that that image was made, or object, and so what was going on and who the people were and where it was and all that kind of stuff, which for me is what was so interesting about it. So the big piece, the sculptural object that's in the middle of the room here, is the most recent in a body of motion-based sculptures that goes back almost 20 years now. Being in college, there was this, there's a long-standing interest in music that really kind of flourished in those years. So I was a DJ for Vanderbilt's radio station for a number of years while I lived in Nashville, and also played in an instrumental post-rock band. And all of those kinds of interests in sequencing, layering, ensemble, et cetera, is kind of influencing the work in a number of ways. So the big piece, the sculptural object that's in the middle of the room here, is the most recent in a body of motion-based sculptures that goes back almost 20 years now. And I guess the starting place to discuss them is this interest in the landscape, not just the agricultural landscape, but maybe man's relationship with the landscape, and particularly this idea of the tumulus, the burial mound, as this kind of pre-architectural structure that exists throughout history, throughout cultures. And so at almost any location in the world, at any point in time, you see some version of this that shows up. So stone stupas in Borobudur, earthworks from Native American cultures, Etruscan tumuli, all the way back to, I think the moment that in my brain this sculpture ended up being a thing was seeing the Newgrange tumulus in Ireland, which is this 5,000-year-old earth mound with a stone barrier around it. And it's older than Stonehenge, it's older than the pyramids, but it's like a monster version of these same earthworks that you see in Italy that happened centuries later. So the question about motion goes back maybe in some ways to, there's an art historical moment for me, but also this kind of background in tinkering and interest in systems and interest in ensemble, et cetera, but also remembering in an art history class, looking at classical sculpture and learning about contrapposto. And this sort of like inside joke of like how it took thousands of years to get from here to like right there, but also that as a moment in the object, and this is where you see all of a sudden the sculpture is evincing or communicating a psychological disposition, and motion is the vehicle that's used to do that. And so the underpinning of this whole body of work and this piece in particular is that question of like, how can an animated object, an object in motion, communicate on a psychological level to the viewer? So the drawings are part of a series called Machine Made. And so what's going on here is there's a very, it's a stretch to even call it a drawing machine, but it's a kind of scenario that's set up to create a drawing. So the piece of paper lays flat on the table, and then there's a wooden box that lays on the piece of paper, and then there are pins attached to a little contraption animated by a cat toy. For me, it came out in a way initially from these things, like looking at all of these lines, but these lines moving in space and kind of thinking about this mark making in space by this mechanized object, and then putting this thing together, and then also kind of contending again with this art history, these studies, and initially being so just like totally smitten with like the Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and all these Abex painters, and then learning that they're all sort of jerks and like rotten people, and having to sort of like contend with that moment of like, the images are still so beautiful, but those guys are just like rotten. So this is a kind of like, for me, like a little bit tongue-in-cheek. This doesn't go on the wall. This isn't part of the wall copy, but celebrating those images, but also sort of like, my cat toy made that Jackson Pollock. My cat toy made that Rothko. Like, deflating them a little bit, perhaps. In and among all of those things, there's also this kind of Martin Puryear quote, this idea of abstract objects or near abstract objects and their ability to communicate or evoke without literally representing any particular thing. And so for me, I feel that very much in these sculptures, that I have an idea of where they came from, but it's so exciting for me to come in and, like, earlier today I came into the gallery and there was somebody exiting and I heard them refer to it as the needle machine. I was like, yeah. Or the opening night somebody called it the porcupine death wheel. I'm like, okay, like that, maybe that should be the name of it. So I like that there's sort of like these serious ideas behind it, but there's also a kind of, there's something just completely silly about the thing. Like, it couldn't be more fake. It's grass moving in the wind, but like you see all the motors and you hear them and all the levers and the gears and everything. So it's kind of like open and honest about its own fakeness.